Elias Hart rode into the town of Garrison with the wind trying to peel the skin from his bones. The cold was a physical thing, a creature with teeth that bit through his wool coat and settled deep in the marrow of his memories. Garrison itself was little more than a scar in the valley. A handful of low, timber-framed buildings hunched against the looming white peaks of the mountains. Snow was piled in drifts that buried fences and wagons, leaving only a narrow track of churned mud and ice down the center of the main street. He was weary. It was a weariness that went beyond the 3-day ride, beyond the ache in his joints. It was the weariness of a man who had seen too much and said too little. A solitary soul defined by the echoes of the range wars that had stolen his youth and left him with nothing but a patch of rocky land high up the mountain and a silence that most folks mistook for meanness. He was here to settle a debt, not his own, but one owed to him, though he had never intended to collect. Years ago, during a skirmish over water rights, he had cornered a young, terrified man from the McCabe clan. The man, Silas McCabe, had begged for his life. And Elias, seeing the white-faced panic of a boy playing at war, had lowered his rifle and let him go. It was a moment of weakness. He had told himself then, now. Silas ran this town, his family's influence spreading like frost, choking out the law. A message had reached Elias a week prior. Come, the debt will be paid. Elias had no need for McCabe's money or gratitude, but a summons like that, in this territory, was not something a man could ignore. He tied his horse, a stoic gray gelding, to the hitching post outside the saloon. The sound of a poorly tuned piano and rough laughter leaked through the warped door. He pushed it open. The heat and the smell of stale whiskey, wet wool, and unwashed men hit him like a physical blow. The room went quiet. Elias Hart was known here, if not liked. He was the hermit, the ghost of the mountain, the man who had survived the wars that had broken everyone else. At a back table, Silas McCabe watched him. Silas had grown into his power. He was a large man, dressed in a waistcoat that strained across his belly, his face florid and confident. "Hart," Silas boomed, gesturing to the empty chair opposite him. "I did not think you would come." "You sent for me, Silas," Elias said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. He did not sit. He did not remove his hat. Silas smiled, a wide gesture that did not reach his cold, watchful eyes. "So I did. A debt is a debt. I am a man of my word." He looked at the men around him, soaking in their silent approval. "You gave me my life, a thing I cannot truly repay, but I can offer payment in kind, something to ease the solitude of those long winters up on that mountain of yours." Elias frowned. "I do not want your money." "I know," Silas said, his smile widening. He nodded to the bartender, who moved to a side door and opened it. A small figure was shoved into the room. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a horse blanket, rough and stained, which she clutched at her throat with one raw-boned hand. Her dark hair was matted, tangled with bits of straw. She kept her head down, her bare feet shuffling on the dirty floorboards. As she was pushed closer to the table, she stumbled, and the light from the lantern caught her face. A deep, ugly bruise, the color of spoiled plums, stained her jaw and cheekbone. Her lip was split. She was silent, but her entire form radiated a shame so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. This was Clara. Elias stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This was the payment. Not cattle, not gold, a person. "She is useful," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Was kept by a powerful man down in the territory. He grew tired of her. Gave her to me to settle a marker." He leaned forward. "She is quiet, does what she is told. A gift. My life for her." The room was utterly still. The townspeople, the prospectors, the trappers, they all looked away. They studied their drinks, the ceiling, Their own hands. They were witnesses to a transaction, no different than the sale of a mule. Elias felt a cold rage build in his chest, a pressure that tightened his throat. He looked from Silas's smug face to the woman. She was trembling, a fine, violent shudder that shook her entire body. "I do not," Elias began, his voice tight. "I do not take people." Silas's smile faded. "No? Then the debt is not paid." He shrugged, a massive, theatrical gesture. "And I have no more use for her." He looked toward the door, out into the biting wind and the gathering dark. "She is free to go, though I doubt she will make it a mile in this freeze. Or perhaps," he added, his eyes sliding to a group of rough-looking men at the bar, "she will find other lodging. The boys at the Mercantile are always looking for new entertainment." Elias understood. It was not a choice. To refuse her was to condemn her. To leave her here meant she would be used by all of them until she broke or died. He looked at her again. She had not moved, had not made a sound. She was just a thing, waiting. He let out a slow breath, the fury settling into a cold, hard knot in his gut. He turned his gaze back to Silas, and the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "The debt is paid," Elias said, the words sharp as ice. He stepped toward the woman. She flinched, a movement so quick he almost missed it, pressing herself back as if expecting a blow. Elias stopped. He did not reach for her. He simply nodded toward the door. "Come," he said. She stared at his boots, uncomprehending. He waited. After a long moment, she seemed to understand. She pulled the thin blanket tighter and, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, moved past him toward the exit. Elias followed her out, leaving the saloon in a heavy, judging silence. The ride back to his cabin was silent and brutal. The wind had picked up, driving needles of snow into their faces. He had pulled his spare blanket from his saddle roll and thrust it at her. She had taken it with the same numb, mechanical obedience, wrapping it over the first one. He walked, leading the gelding. He had gestured for her to take the saddle, but she had shrunk away from him, shaking her head in that silent, terrified way. So he walked, and she followed, a small, dark shape plodding through the snow in his wake, leaving tiny, bare footprints that the wind erased almost instantly. He was confused, and he was angry. Angry at Silas for the insult, angry at the town for its cowardice, and angry at himself for being trapped in this. What in God's name was he supposed to do with her? He lived alone. He preferred it. His cabin was a one-room shelter, a fortress against the world he had left behind. It was not a place for this. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and his boy, gone these 10 years, killed by men just like the ones in that saloon. The memory was a fresh wound, a cold place in his heart that never warmed. He had built this life of solitude to ensure he would never feel that loss again. And now, this, a living, breathing woman, bruised and broken, delivered to his door like a stray dog. They reached the cabin after 2 hours, the structure barely visible against the snow-covered pines, a thin curl of smoke from his morning fire still whispering from the stone chimney. He pushed the door open, gesturing her inside. The cabin was small, but it was clean and warm. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rope-strung cot was on the other. Opposite his own bedroll, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding basic provisions made up the rest of the furnishings. Clara moved immediately to the darkest corner, near the woodpile, and sank down onto the floor. Pulling her knees to her chest, she sat there, wrapped in the 2 blankets, and stared at the wall. Elias brought in his saddlebags and rifle. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man long accustomed to solitude. He added wood to the fire, the flames leaping up to cast flickering shadows. He dipped a ladle into the pot of venison stew that hung over the hearth and poured it into a tin bowl. He set the bowl on the floor. A few feet away from her, he placed a spoon beside it. She did not look at it. She did not look at him. "Eat," he said. She flinched at his voice but did not move. Elias sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He was not a patient man, but he was not a cruel one. He took his own bowl of stew and sat at the table, his back to her. He ate slowly, the scrape of his spoon loud in the suffocating silence. When he was finished, he cleaned his bowl. He glanced over his shoulder. She had not moved. The stew was untouched, steam rising from it in the cold air. He laid out his bedroll near the door, a position he had taken for 10 years, always listening, always ready. He pointed to the cot. "That is yours." She gave no sign she had heard. He took off his coat and hat, but nothing else. He lay down on the bedroll, his rifle within easy reach, and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl and the sound of her quiet, desperate breathing. For 3 days, she did not speak. She remained in her corner, a small, still shadow. He would leave food for her, and it would remain untouched until he left the cabin to chop wood or check his snares. When he returned, the bowl would be empty, scrubbed clean, and placed back on the table. She would not eat in front of him. She would not look at him. When he moved, she froze. When he spoke, gruff commands like, "More wood for the fire," or "Water is low," she would obey, her movements stiff with terror, but she would not meet his eyes. He treated her with a distant, quiet dignity. He gave her space. He offered food and the warmth of his fire. He turned his back when she attended to her needs in the corner bucket. He left a clean shirt of his on the cot, which she eventually put on, the coarse linen hanging ridiculously large on her small frame, and he never, ever touched her. He sensed, beneath her fear, a wariness that was absolute. She was a coiled spring, wound so tight he feared she would shatter. She was convinced, he knew, that this was all a prelude. This quiet, this space, this food, it was just the calm before the violence. She was waiting for him to demand the payment Silas had implied. She was waiting to be used. As she sat by the fire one night, staring into the flames, her mind, numbed by cold and fear, finally unlocked. She was not Clara anymore. She was a ghost. She remembered a different fire, a fireplace made of imported marble. She remembered the smell of brandy and cigar smoke, and the heavy, proprietary hand of Arthur Vance. He had been a powerful man, a banker who owned senators and mines. She had been his mistress, kept in a small, fine house, dressed in silks. She had been foolish enough to believe his claims of affection. She had been his prized possession. Then she had found the ledger. She had waited up for him one night, worried, and had overheard him speaking with 2 men. She had heard them laugh about the accident at the silver mine, the one that had killed 12 miners. It had been no accident. It had been sabotage, meant to ruin a competitor. Later, stupidly, she had gone looking in his study. She found the ledger detailing the payments. Arthur had found her there, holding the book. He had not yelled. He had not struck her. He had simply stopped smiling. The look in his eyes was the look a man gives a horse with a broken leg. He had taken the book from her, stroked her hair, and called her his pretty, foolish girl. The next day, she was taken from the house. Her silk dresses were replaced with the rough cotton she now wore. She was put in the back of a wagon and delivered to Garrison, traded to Silas McCabe to settle one of Arthur's gambling debts. She had been silenced, discarded, and given away. Her punishment for discovering a crime was to become an object, from Arthur to Silas, and now, from Silas to this cold, silent man on the mountain. Her flashback ended as a log in the fire cracked, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. She looked at Elias. He was sitting at the table, mending a tear in his leather glove with an awl and thread. He was focused, his scarred hands steady. He was not Arthur. He was not Silas. He was something else. something she did not understand. A week into her arrival, the real storm hit. It came from the north, a wall of white that erased the world. The snow fell without pause for days, piling in massive drifts that blocked the door and covered the small window. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. Elias was forced inside. He could no longer leave for his long patrols or his woodcutting. He spent his time methodically cleaning his weapons, sharpening his knives, and carving small, intricate figures from pieces of scrap wood, a bird, a wolf, a deer. He would carve for hours, the scrape of his knife the only sound. Clara watched him from her corner. She watched his hands. They were rough, calloused, and scarred, but his movements were precise, gentle. He treated the wood with a care she had never been afforded. The confinement pressed in on them. The silence stretched, becoming heavier, more intimate. They breathed the same air, felt the same cabin-bound chill. He watched her from afar. He saw the way she rubbed her arms to stay warm, the way her eyes, no longer completely vacant, followed the flames. She was still numb, but she was present. One night, the storm reached a fever pitch. The wind shrieked like a dying animal, rattling the door in its frame. The fire cast the only light, making the shadows in the corners dance and deepen. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on a cloth on the table. Clara had been still for hours, huddled on the cot. Then she stood up. Elias did not look up, but he tensed. Every sense was aware of her movement. She walked slowly, hesitantly, into the center of the room, into the firelight. He finally raised his head. She stood before him, her hands clenched at her sides. She was trembling again, but it was not from the cold. It was from a desperate resolve. This man had fed her. He had sheltered her. He had not struck her. In her world, such things must be paid for. She was a burden, and she knew what happened to useless burdens. She had to prove her value, the only way she knew how. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper. The first words she had spoken in his presence. "Sir?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He simply waited. With a shaking hand, she reached for the top button of the linen shirt he had given her. She fumbled with it, her fingers stiff. She undid the first button, then the second, exposing the pale skin of her collarbone. She was offering herself to him, her eyes shut tight, bracing for the disgust, the roughness, the inevitable completion of the transaction. It was her only survival tool. Elias watched her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the self-hatred in the set of her shoulders, the abject terror in her clenched eyelids. He saw the bruises, faded now, but still visible. He saw the ruin Arthur Vance and Silas McCabe had made. He slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze back to the rifle piece in his hand. He picked up his oil rag and began to wipe it down, his motions steady. "Get your blanket," he said. His voice was low, rougher than the wind. "You will catch your death." Clara froze, her hand still at her chest. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. She had expected him to take her, or to hit her for being so bold. Nothing. This was confusion. She did not move, her mind racing. Perhaps she had not been clear. "I can," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I can be of use." Elias stopped his work. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the shriek of the storm. "I didn't buy you," he said. The words hung in the air. Clara's breath hitched. She stared at him, her eyes wide open now, searching his profile for any sign of anything. But he was just a man, cleaning his gun, staring into the fire. He had not bought her. The implication of those 4 words shattered her. He was not her owner. He was not her keeper. He was not a customer. He was just a man, and she was a woman. This rejection confused her more than any violence could have. Violence. She understood. Cruelty. She understood. This quiet refusal of her only perceived worth was a language she did not speak. It meant that everything she believed about herself, about her place in the world, was wrong. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. She collapsed onto the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The buttons of the shirt were still open, but she did not care. Clara's tears began to fall. They were not the loud, desperate sobs of her nightmares. They were silent, hot tears that tracked down her temples and into her matted hair. The trauma of her past, the shame, the reduction of her life to a simple transaction. It all festered. But this man, this stranger, had just told her she was not for sale. Elias Hart did not turn around. He did not comfort her. He continued to meticulously clean his rifle, giving her the space and the dignity to weep in the darkness. The great storm broke, leaving the world scoured and blindingly white. The silence that followed was vast, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the distant crack of tree branches surrendering to the weight of the ice. Inside the cabin, the quiet had changed. It was no longer the brittle, terrified silence of Clara's first days, nor the tense, cabin-bound silence of the blizzard. It was an awkward, expectant quiet. Elias Hart's rejection of her desperate offer had thrown her world off its axis. He had demanded nothing, which, in her experience, meant he would eventually take everything. But days had passed since that night. He had returned to his routine as if nothing had happened, his manner just as distant, his actions just as proper. He still placed her food by the fire. He still turned his back. Clara, however, could no longer just sit in the corner. The shame of her offer had faded, replaced by a restless, confusing energy. She was a burden. She ate his food. She used his warmth. And she offered nothing in return. If he would not take the only payment she knew, she would have to find another. One morning, Elias pulled on his heavy coat and picked up his axe. He paused at the door, his back to her. "The woodpile is low," he said, his voice filling the small space. Clara stood up from the cot, her heart hammering. I can help." He glanced at her over his shoulder. He saw the thinness of her arms, the pallor of her skin. He gave a short, hard sigh. "Stay inside. It is not work for you." "Please," she said, the words stronger than she expected. "I will not be baggage." He studied her for a long moment. He saw the flicker of resolve in her eyes, a spark he had not seen before. It was not fear, it was determination. He nodded once, slowly. "Get your coat." She had no coat. She had only the blankets. She wrapped one around her shoulders, tying it in a knot at her chest, and followed him out the door. The cold was a shock, a slap that stole her breath. The snow was deep, coming up to her knees, and she struggled to walk in the tracks he made. The air was so clear and sharp it felt like breathing in glass. He led her to the woodpile, a half-buried mound of logs near the side of the cabin, protected by an overhang. He handed her a smaller hatchet. "Kindling," he said. "Start with the small branches. Do not try to be strong. Be smart. Aim for the cracks." He took the large splitting axe and moved to a thick stump he used as a block. With a powerful, economic swing, he brought the axe down. The thwack of the metal on wood echoed in the silent valley, followed by the clean crack of the logs splitting in two. Clara watched him. He moved with a rhythm, a grim grace. He was a man of immense physical strength, yet he had not used an ounce of it against her. She turned to her own task. The hatchet felt impossibly heavy. She picked up a branch, brittle with ice, and tried to imitate his swing. The hatchet bounced off, stinging her hands and sending a jolt up her arm. She gasped, dropping it in the snow. Elias stopped, leaning on his axe. "Your hands are too close together. Spread them. Let the weight of the head do the work, and swing true. A glancing blow is a dangerous one." She flushed, ashamed of her weakness. She picked up the hatchet again, adjusted her grip, and swung. This time, the blade bit into the wood. It was not a clean split, but it was a start. They worked for an hour. Elias split the large rounds, and Clara, with painful, clumsy effort, managed to reduce a pile of branches to a respectable mound of kindling. Her hands were raw, her fingers numb, and a muscle in her back screamed in protest. But she was not cold. A deep, burning warmth had spread through her, the warmth of work. When they were done, he gathered the split logs and she carried an armload of her kindling. Back inside the cabin, she knelt by the hearth and, without asking, began to stack the small pieces beside the fireplace. "You have blisters," he said. She stopped, looking at her hands. They were red and angry, the skin already broken in 2 places. He went to his saddlebag and took out a small tin. He opened it and offered it to her. It was a dark, strong-smelling salve. "Tallow and pine tar," he said. "It will keep the wounds from fouling." She hesitated, then slowly reached out and dipped her fingers into the tin. The gesture felt monumental. He had provided medicine. He was tending to her, not as a possession, but as a worker. Later that afternoon, she was sitting on the cot, rubbing her aching shoulders, when she noticed the state of her dress. The thin, gray cotton garment she had arrived in was filthy and torn at the shoulder, the seam ripped open from her fall in the saloon. Elias was at the table, checking his snare lines. "Do you have," she started, her voice faltering, "a needle and thread?" He looked up. He considered the dress, then her. He shook his head. "Thread will not hold. The fabric is too weak." He went to a chest at the foot of his bedroll and rummaged inside. He pulled out a thin, supple piece of tanned deer hide and a small leather-working kit containing an awl and a length of sinew. He tossed them onto the cot beside her. "Use this. The awl will punch the holes. The sinew will hold." He was helping her mend her own clothes. He was teaching her. She spent the next hour working, her fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar tools. Pushing the sharp awl through the fabric and the leather patch was hard work, but the result was strong. She was binding her torn dress with the same materials he used for his own survival. When she finished, the patch on her shoulder was rough, but it was solid. "Thank you," she said, looking at the floor. "It is a necessary chore," he replied, not looking up. But she had spoken, and he had answered. The cabin felt different, larger. The next day, she went out on her own to gather fallen branches. She moved slowly, breathing in the scent of pine and snow. She felt a sliver of something she had not felt in years: peace. She wandered a little farther from the cabin than she intended, pushing through a drift of snow to reach a thick branch. She brushed the snow aside and stopped. There were 2 of them, 2 wooden crosses, gray and weathered, driven deep into the frozen earth. They were at the edge of the clearing, overlooking the valley. One was man-sized, the other was heartbreakingly small. She did not need to ask. This was the grave, his grave. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her boots. This was the source of the silence in him, the vast, cold emptiness she had mistaken for cruelty. This was his range war. She heard the crunch of his boots in the snow behind her. She did not turn. Elias stood 10 feet away, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the crosses. A muscle worked in his jaw. This was his private space, and she had trespassed. "Sarah," he said. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual hardness. "And Samuel." "His wife? His child? What happened?" Clara whispered, her own breath catching. He stared at the valley, his gaze turned inward, to a time she could not see. "Outlaws." He said, the word was a curse, spat onto the snow. "Rode through while I was in town for supplies. They did not care who was in the cabin. They just wanted the food and the horse." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "I was gone 6 hours. When I came back, there was just the smoke." Clara pressed her raw hands to her mouth, a sob welling in her throat. "I buried them," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Then I went after the men who did it. I found them." He did not need to say what happened next. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She could see the vengeance that had hollowed him out, that had driven him up this mountain to live with the ghosts. "I am sorry," she said. "It was all she had. It was nothing." Elias turned, his face a mask of old grief. "There is nothing to be sorry for. It is done." He walked back to the cabin, leaving her alone with his dead. She understood him now. He was not a recluse by choice. He was a man living in his own mausoleum, a man who had already lost everything he had ever loved. He was protecting her not because he wanted her, but because he could not bear to watch another soul be destroyed. A few days later, Elias was splitting the last of the large logs he had hauled before the storm. He was working with a furious, contained energy, the memory of the grave hanging over him, making his swings heavy. He was thinking of Samuel, of the small, whittled toy he had been carving for his son's birthday, the one he never got to deliver. The axe bit into a knot, twisted in his grip. He tried to pull it free, but the blade was stuck. Frustrated, he yanked it hard. The blade came loose suddenly, skittering off the wood and glancing across his left forearm, which he had braced on the log. "Damnation!" he roared, stumbling back. Blood welled instantly, a dark red line that dripped onto the white snow. It was not a mortal wound, but it was deep, long, and bleeding freely. Clara heard his cry from inside the cabin. She ran to the door, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw him standing by the stump, his hand clamped over his arm, blood running between his fingers. The numb, frozen girl who had arrived weeks ago was gone. Clara moved. She ran back inside, grabbed a strip of clean linen she had torn for rags, and snatched the water bucket. She was back at his side in seconds. "Let me see," she commanded, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Elias, pale and surprised by her sudden authority, slowly lowered his hand. The cut was ugly. "It needs stitches," she said, her mind racing. "But it must be clean first." She dipped the rag into the icy water, wringing it out. He flinched as the cold cloth touched his skin, but she held his arm in a steady, strong grip. She was not gentle, she was efficient. She washed away the blood and the bark, her touch practical, impersonal. "Inside," she said. "By the fire. I need to see it clearly." He followed her, slightly dazed. He sat heavily at the table. Clara fetched the needle and the sinew he had given her. She threaded the needle with a steady hand. "This will hurt," she said. "Get on with it," he gritted, bracing himself. She did. Her movements were quick and sure. She stitched the wound closed, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her. He watched her pale, bruised face, now alive with purpose. He saw the small, focused movements of her mouth as she worked. He felt her touch, not the touch of a lover, not the touch of a victim, but the touch of a healer. It was the first human contact he had allowed himself in a decade that was not violent. When she was finished, she wrapped the wound tightly with another strip of linen. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading. "It is done," she whispered. Elias looked at the bandage, then at her. A faint trust, fragile as a layer of new ice, began to form between them. He had needed help, and she had given it. She had not panicked. She had not recoiled. She had acted. "You have a steady hand," he said, his voice gruff. My mother," Clara said, her voice catching. "She was skilled with herbs. She taught me some things." He nodded, accepting the information. He had shared his grief. Now she had shared a piece of her past. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted permanently. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable. Elias was nursing his bandaged arm. Clara was mending one of his shirts. "Who were you?" he asked quietly. Clara stopped her work. She stared into the flames, her mind traveling back to the life before Arthur Vance, and the life with him. "I was a nobody," she said, her voice low. "My family were farmers. We lost our land. I went to the city. I tried to find work as a seamstress." She shook her head. "I was noticed by a man, a rich man." She did not need to explain the details. Elias understood the predator-prey relationship of the frontier towns. "He gave me things," she continued, her voice hardening. "Dresses, a place to live. He told me I was different. I was not like the others. I was special to him." She let out a laugh, a dry, bitter sound. "I believed him. I was a fool." She did not speak of the murder she had discovered. It was too soon. It was too dangerous. But she spoke of the betrayal. "When I was no longer special, he gave me away, like a horse he was done with. He traded me to Silas McCabe, and Silas," her voice cracked, "he let them—" She could not finish. She did not have to. The shame and the pain radiated from her. She had been punished for her foolhardy trust, silenced, and passed from man to man until she landed here, at the feet of a stranger. Elias listened, his face grim. He saw the full scope of what he had done at the saloon. He had not just rescued a woman. He had interrupted a long, dark chain of human cruelty. "You are not those things," he said, his voice quiet but fierce. "You are not what they did to you." She looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "What am I then? I am just ruined." "No," he said. He leaned forward, his good hand resting on his knee. "You are a survivor. I know the look of them." He told her more about his own past. He spoke of the vengeance that had consumed him for 2 years, how he had hunted the 4 men who destroyed his family, one by one, across 2 territories. He spoke of the emptiness that came after the last man was dead. "I thought it would bring me peace," he said, staring into the fire. "I thought it would let Sarah and Samuel rest. But it did not. It just made me empty. I came up here to wait for the end. I was just as dead as them." "But you are not," Clara said softly. "You saved me." "I did not know how to do anything else," he said. The confession hung in the air, a shared truth. They were 2 broken people, finding jagged edges that fit together in the darkness. A few days later, Clara was cleaning the cabin, truly cleaning it for the first time. She had a purpose now, a role. She was not a guest, not a prisoner. She was a partner, in some small way. While sweeping behind the woodpile that Elias kept stocked inside, her broom hit something solid. She knelt, moving the logs aside. Tucked deep in the recess, hidden behind the firewood, was a book. It was wrapped in oilcloth. She carefully unwrapped it. It was a Bible. The leather cover was worn smooth, the corners soft with use. She opened it. On the inside page, in faded ink, was an inscription. "To my son, Elias, may you walk in the light. Reverend Hart, 1859. Elias, a preacher's son. She was still holding it when he came inside, his arm full of firewood. He froze when he saw the Bible in her hands. He looked ashamed, like a child caught in a lie. He dropped the wood by the hearth. "It was my father's—" You were a preacher?" she asked, her mind reeling. The man she knew was a killer, a recluse, a cowboy hardened by war. "No," he said sharply. "I was his son. I believed. Once, I believed in mercy and goodness and a God that watched over his flock." He ran his good hand over his face. "Then I saw what men really are. I saw what they did to my family. There is no mercy in this world. Clara, only what you can take and what you can defend." He took the Bible from her, his touch almost reverent. and placed it back in its hiding spot, burying it under the wood. "Why do you keep it?" she asked. "I do not know," he said, and turned away. But Clara knew. She knew that the preacher's son was still inside him, buried deep. It was the preacher's son who had turned away from her that night. It was the preacher's son who had stood between her and the world, who had given her a home when she was nothing. He was a man at war with himself, and she was caught in the middle. The uneasy peace was shattered a week later. The snow had begun to melt in the valley, turning the main road into a river of mud. Elias was outside, his arm healing, checking the perimeter of his land, when he heard them. "Horses, at least 4, moving fast." He ran back to the cabin. "Clara, get inside. Stay away from the door." She saw the look on his face and her blood ran cold. She ran to the cot and huddled, her heart pounding. Elias grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and stood just inside the cabin door, waiting. The horses pulled up, splashing mud. Clara risked a peek through a crack in the wall. It was not Silas McCabe. It was a group of rough men, the same men she had seen at the saloon, the ones who had watched her with hungry eyes. A big man with a tobacco-stained beard seemed to be the leader. "Halt!" the man yelled, staying on his horse. "We are here for the property." Elias stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, the muzzle pointing at the ground, but he was ready. "She is not property," Elias said, his voice calm and cold. The leader laughed. "Do not play games, hermit. Silas McCabe wants what is his. He was generous, letting you borrow her. But he wants her back now. Says you had no right to keep her." "I have every right," Elias said. "She is under my protection. She is not going anywhere." The 4 men looked at each other. They were armed, 4 against 1, but the one was Elias Hart. "That is a bad decision," the leader said, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "Silas will not be happy. He runs this valley. You are making an enemy of a powerful man, all for a used-up woman." Elias raised the rifle. It was not a sudden move, but it was final. He did not aim at the man. He aimed at the space between his eyes. "Get off my land," Elias said. The man's bravado faltered. He saw the look in Elias's eyes. It was the flat, dead look of a man who had killed before and would kill again. A man with nothing left to lose. "This is not over. Hart," the man snarled. He pulled his horse's head around. "You have made enemies. You and your woman. You will regret this." They wheeled their horses and galloped away, churning the mud in their wake. Elias stood there for a long time, the rifle in his hands, until the sound of the horses faded completely. He came back inside, barring the door. Clara was pale, trembling. "They will come back." "Yes," Elias said. He began to check his ammunition, laying out cartridges on the table. That night, the terror she had been holding at bay finally claimed her. She fell asleep, but her sleep was not rest. She was back in garrison, in the back room of the saloon. Silas was there, and Arthur Vance, and they were laughing. The men were holding her down, their hands on her, their breath hot and sour. She screamed, but no sound came out. She was property. She was nothing. "No, please, do not!" Elias woke instantly. He was on his feet, his gun in his hand, before he realized the cry had come from inside the cabin. Clara was fighting the blankets on her cot, sobbing, her eyes wide and unseeing. "No, please, no more." He crossed the room in 2 strides. "Clara," he said, shaking her shoulder. "Wake up. You are safe." She gasped, her eyes focusing on him. She saw the rifle in his hand and flinched, scrambling backward on the cot. "No." "It is me," he said, setting the rifle down. "Elias, you were dreaming. You are safe." She looked around the dark cabin, her breathing ragged. She saw the barred door, the dying fire, the man standing over her, his face etched with concern. She broke. The fear from the men, the memory of her past, the terror of the future. It all came crashing down. A raw, ragged sob tore from her throat. Elias hesitated. He was a man of action, not of comfort, but he saw her, truly saw her, small and shattered. He sat on the edge of the cot, his bad arm aching. He was stiff, awkward, a man unaccustomed to gentleness. Clara, in her desperate need for an anchor, did the unthinkable. She moved toward him, burying her face against his chest, her small hands clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. She clung to him, shaking. Elias froze, his entire body tensed. He wanted to pull away, to put the distance back between them, but he felt the desperate, animal terror coming off her in waves. He smelled the soap he had given her, the scent of wood smoke in her hair. Slowly, awkwardly, he raised his good arm and put it around her. He did not pat her back, he did not whisper soothing words. He just held her, a solid, unmoving presence in the darkness, a human shield against the memories that haunted her. They stayed like that for a long time, her sobs slowly quieting into shudders. He could feel the warmth of her tears soaking his shirt. Finally, she pulled back, wiping her face, ashamed of her weakness. "I am sorry," she whispered. "No," he said. She looked at him, at the man who had faced down 4 gunmen for her, the man who had stitched his own arm, the man who was now sitting on her bed in the dark. She reached out, her fingers lightly touching the bandage on his arm, the one she had tied. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "Thanky_merging_." The peace was false, and Elias' heart knew it. It was in the air, a metallic taste on his tongue, a shift in the way the silence settled over the valley. After he had sent Silas McCabe's men packing, the mountain was no longer a refuge. It was a high, cold prison, and they were being watched. He found the first sign 3 days later, down by the creek line, a cigar stub, half buried in the mud, of a brand too expensive for any trapper. Someone had been there, stationary for a long time, watching the cabin. Clara saw the next sign, a glint of light on the far ridge, where there was only rock and sky. She had been outside, gathering wood, and the flash was quick, like sunlight off a spyglass or a rifle barrel. She dropped the wood and ran inside, her face the color of ash. "They are there," she whispered, pointing. "On the ridge. I saw them." Elias did not go to the window. He did not need to. He simply nodded, his face hardening. "I know." The fear returned to her. Colder this time. It was no longer the shapeless terror of a victim. It was the specific, sharp fear of a witness. She knew why they would not just leave her alone. She knew what Silas McCabe and his family were capable of. She had seen it. They were not just angry that Elias had taken her. They were terrified of what she might say. "They know," she said, her voice small. "They know I saw. That is why Arthur, that is why he sent me away. That is why Silas, he was supposed to—" "Supposed to what?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Make sure I was never heard from again," she breathed. "And you took me?" Elias looked at her, his eyes dark. He finally understood. She was not just a discarded woman. She was a threat, and by protecting her, he had painted a target on both of their backs. "Then you will learn to fight back," he said. The next morning, he took his pistol from his belt and laid it on the table. It was a Colt, heavy and dark. Clara stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. "I cannot," she said, shaking her head. I do not like them." "It does not matter what you like," Elias said, his voice flat. "It matters what you can do when I am not here. Pick it up." She reached out a trembling hand and wrapped her fingers around the grip. The weight of it surprised her. A solid, deadly cold. "It is too heavy." "It is supposed to be. It has to stop a man," he said. He took her hand, his own scarred, warm grip covering hers. It was not a gentle touch. It was the touch of an instructor. He did not hold her. He held her hand to the gun, forcing her to feel the shape and balance of it. This is your life. You hold it like you mean to keep it. He took her outside, away from the cabin, and set up a tin can on a fence post 50 feet away. You are clumsy, he said, not unkindly. You are small. That does not matter. The gun makes you equal. Now, do not aim down the barrel, not at this distance. You point it, like you are pointing your finger. Point at the can. She raised the heavy weapon. Her arm shook. Breathe, he commanded. Let your breath out halfway. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Do not jerk it. Squeeze it, like you are squeezing water from a rag. Slow. She shut her eyes. Open your eyes, he snapped. You cannot shoot what you cannot see. She opened them, tears of frustration stinging them. She tried to focus on the can. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The pistol kicked in her hand, slamming back against her palm, and she cried out, dropping it in the snow. The shot had gone wide, kicking up a puff of dirt 10 feet to the left of the can. Her ears rang, and the smell of sulfur filled her nose. I told you not to drop it, Elias said, his voice hard. He picked it up, checked it, and handed it back to her. Again. She was clumsy. She was terrified of the noise. She flinched every time she pulled the trigger. She missed the can a dozen times, the ground around it pockmarked by her failures. I cannot, she finally cried, throwing the pistol down again. I am useless. You are determined, Elias countered, his voice quiet, stopping her in her tracks. You are still standing here. You have not run inside. Pick it up. She stared at him, at the unyielding set of his jaw. He was not angry at her failure. He simply would not allow it. She took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped the tears from her face with her sleeve, and picked up the pistol. She raised it. She looked at the can. She let out her breath. She pointed. She squeezed. The ping of the bullet hitting the metal was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The can leaped from the post and vanished into the snowdrift behind it. Clara stared, her mouth open. She had done it. Good, Elias said. The word was low, but it held a warmth that went straight through her. Again. She turned to him, and a slow, watery, unfamiliar feeling spread across her face. It was a smile. Her first, it was rusted from disuse, but it was real. I hid it, she whispered. You did, he said. He did not smile back, but his eyes were soft for a moment. Now you must learn to ride. He taught her on his gray gelding, a stoic animal that seemed to possess its owner's patience. She was afraid of the horse, of its size, of the height, but Elias was firm. You do not ride him, he said. You ride with him. He can feel you trembling. He thinks you are a fool. Show him you are not. He taught her to mount, to hold the reins, to move with the animal's gait. She was clumsy. She fell, landing hard in the snow, but she got back up every time her jaw set and pulled herself back into the saddle. He praised her determination, and that praise was more nourishing than food. Their isolation was confirmed a week later. An old trapper, Amos, who sometimes traded pelts with Elias, made his way up the mountain. He was a friend, or as close to a friend as Elias had. He looked nervous as he accepted a cup of coffee. Elias, he said, not looking at Clara, who was cleaning the dishes by the fire. You ought not come into garrison. I do not plan to, Elias said. No, I mean it, Amos said, twisting his hat in his hands. The talk is bad. Real bad. What talk? Elias asked. Though he already knew, Amos finally chanced to look at Clara. They are saying things about the woman, that she is a whore, that you have taken up with Silas McCabe's property. They are calling you a madman. Elias, saying you have lost your mind, holding up here with a fallen woman. Clara froze, her back to them. The word hit her like a physical blow, stripping away the small dignity she had built. Whore. It did not matter that she had learned to shoot, or to mend, or to chop wood. To the world, that is all she would ever be. "Get out, Amos," Elias said. His voice was not loud, it was deadly. "I am just warning you, Elias." "I said, get out." Amos scrambled to his feet and left, casting one last, pitying look at Clara. When the door shut, Clara remained perfectly still, her knuckles white as she gripped the tin plate. "Clara," Elias said. "It does not matter," she whispered, her voice tight. "It is what I am." "It is a word," he said, walking over to her. "It is just air. It means nothing." "It means everything," she said, turning to him, her eyes bright with a new, cold fury. "It means I am not a person. I am a thing. It means they can do what they want, and no one will stop them. It means I am nothing." "You are not nothing to me," he said. The words, so simple, so plain, silenced her. He had not said she was special. He had not said she was beautiful. He had said she was not nothing. For Clara, that was more than any poet's verse. From that day, she changed. The fear did not leave, but it was joined by a simmering anger, and she began to work. She did not just help, she insisted. She claimed her place in that cabin not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a partner. She was the first one up, stirring the fire. She gathered kindling until her hands were permanently scarred. She took over the cooking, turning their meager supplies of flour, salt, and dried venison into passable, warm meals. She tended the gelding, grooming its coat until it shone, learning the feel of the animal, conquering her fear through sheer repetition. When a leak sprang in the roof from the melting snow, Elias climbed up to fix it. He expected her to stay inside. Minutes later, she was climbing the rough ladder behind him, her hands and knees scraping on the bark, carrying the pot of pine tar he had melted. "I told you to stay down," he said, startled. "You need 2 hands to fix the roof," she said, setting the pot down. "One to hold the shingle, one to hammer. You only have 2. I will hold." They worked all afternoon, high above the snow, the valley spread out below them. He hammered, and she held the new split wooden shingles in place. They worked in a rhythm, a silent, practiced dance. She felt the sun on her back. She felt the satisfaction of a solid, mended roof beneath her. She felt a joy in the labor, a sharp, clean feeling that scrubbed at the old stains inside her. She was not a whore. She was a woman mending a roof. The winter broke, giving way to a false spring, a week of impossible warmth that sent the snow into a full retreat. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, became a rushing, muddy torrent. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. They were both filthy. Weeks of smoke, sweat, and fear clung to them. "The creek is high," Elias said one morning, looking at the sun. "But it is warm. We should clean up while we can." Clara's heart stammered. "Bathe? Here?" He seemed to understand. He went to his supply chest and took out a small, precious sliver of lye soap. He handed it to her, along with a clean linen towel. "Go," he said, "down by the bend. The water is slower there. I will watch." She knew what he meant. He would stand guard, not to watch her, but to watch the ridges. She went, her pistol tucked into the waistband of her mended dress. She found the bend, a place where the water pooled, relatively calm, behind a large boulder. She looked back. Elias was 100 yards upstream, his rifle in his hands, his back to her. He was staring at the far ridge, a solid, unmoving sentinel. Clara turned, her hands shaking. She took off her clothes, the rough dress, the shirt, the bindings. She laid them on the rock. She stood bare in the warm sun. She looked at her body. It was thin, bruised, and marked. It was the body of a survivor. She stepped into the water. It was so cold it burned. She gasped, a sharp, involuntary cry. She forced herself under, scrubbing at her skin with the soap, washing away the saloon, and Silas, and Arthur. She washed her hair, letting the icy water run over her scalp. She felt new. She felt clean. She stood up, the water sluicing off her, and turned, breathing in the fresh air. She looked at Elias. He was still standing guard, his back to her, a broad, solid back, covered by a worn wool shirt. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his rifle. He was protecting her. Even in this, he was giving her this moment of peace, of dignity, at the risk of his own life. She watched him, her curiosity a sudden, sharp ache. He was a man of contradictions, a killer who hid a Bible, a recluse who had saved her, a man of immense strength who had never touched her with anything but respect. She felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a strange, terrifying pull, a feeling of want. She was conflicted. To want him was to be the thing the town called her, but to feel this pulling gratitude, it felt like the only true thing she had left. She dressed quickly and walked back toward him, her wet hair clinging to her neck. "It is your turn," she said, her voice quiet. He nodded. He took the soap from her, their fingers brushing. The small, accidental contact was like a bolt of lightning. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "You watch," he said, gesturing to the rifle. "You see anything at all. You fire 2 shots, then you run for the high rocks." He left her and went down to the bend. Clara held the rifle. It was heavy, but she held it steady. She did not turn her back. She did not give him the same courtesy he had given her. She sat on the rock, the rifle across her knees, and she watched the ridge. She did not look at him. She protected him. That night, the cabin was filled with a new tension. It was not fear, it was awareness. They had seen each other's vulnerability. They sat by the fire. The air was soft, and they left the door open a crack, letting in the sound of the dripping water. "You did well today," Elias said, cleaning his pistol. "With the roof and the rifle." "You are a good teacher," she replied. A long silence settled. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. If they leave us be." Elias stopped his work. He stared into the fire. He had not allowed himself to think after in 10 years. After was a luxury he had buried with his wife and son. I always dreamed of land," he said, his voice rough. "Not this." He gestured to the mountain. "This is just rock and memory. But land you can put a plow in, down in the valleys. Land that can grow things. A place to be." He fell silent, as if ashamed of the confession. "To be alone?" she asked. He looked at her. His eyes were full of a deep, old loneliness. "I thought so, but no, it is no good. Being alone, I had that once. A real partner. Someone to build with." He was speaking of Sarah. She knew. He was speaking of a life that was gone. Clara looked at her hands, the hands that had fixed a roof, the hands that had learned to fire a gun. They were not the soft hands of Arthur's mistress. They were calloused and capable. "What if," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "What if I am not ruined? What if I am just new?" Elias looked at her, truly looked at Bee. He saw the woman by the creek, the woman on the roof, the woman who had stitched his arm and faced down her nightmares. He saw the strength that had been forged in her own private fire. "You are not ruined," he said. His voice was absolute. "You are not." The space between them crackled. He was not just a protector. She was not just a victim. They were a man and a woman, sitting by a fire, having survived. He leaned in. It was a slow, hesitant movement. She did not pull away. She did not know what this was, but she knew it was not the prelude to violence. It was something else. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, aching grief. It was the meeting of two solitudes. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, and the barest, most fragile hint of hope. It was a quiet, tentative question. Clara's eyes shut, and she returned it. A small, broken gesture. But then, the terror surged. This was real. This was a man she respected, a man she might want. To want was to be vulnerable. To want was to have something to lose. She remembered Arthur, the lies. She remembered the saloon, the hands. She pulled back, a small gasp escaping her. She put her fingers to her lips, her eyes wide with fear. Not fear of him, fear of the hope he represented. I cannot, she whispered, scrambling to her feet. Please, I am not. Elias watched her go, his face a mask of old pain. He had crossed a line, and he had frightened her. He closed his eyes, the taste of her on his lips, and felt the familiar, cold grip of loss settle over him once more. He had reached for something, and it had recoiled. 2 days later, the supplies ran out. Not the wood, not the venison, but the necessities. The salt, the flour, and most important, the cartridges. His training had used up more than he planned. I have to go to town, he said. Clara's blood ran cold.
No, Elias, no. You heard Amos. They will be waiting for you.
We are out of shells, he said simply. A gun without bullets is a stick. We are out of salt. We will not last 2 weeks without it. I have to go.
I will go,
she said, her voice desperate. They will not hurt me, he said, a coldness in his eyes. Not kill me, not yet. They want to prove a point, but they will not let you return. I am going. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any sound but my voice. Keep the pistol close. He put on his coat, tucked his empty pistol in his belt, and slid his rifle into its scabbard on the gelding. He rode out at dawn. Clara did as he said. She barred the door. She sat at the table, the loaded pistol in front of her, and she waited. The morning dragged. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, was a new terror. She cleaned the cabin. She re-cleaned it. She paced. The sun hit its zenith and began its slow, cruel descent. The shadows grew long. The cabin grew cold. She lit a lamp. Still, he did not come. She was imagining it now. Him, ambushed on the road. Him, lying in the mud. Him, captured by Silas's men. The despair was so thick she could barely breathe. She had allowed herself to hope. She had allowed herself to feel. And the world was punishing her for it, by taking away the only decent man she had ever known. Then she heard it, a horse, not the steady, strong gait of his gelding, but a stumbling, uneven sound. She ran to the door, the pistol in her hand. Elias, she called. A low groan answered her. Clara, it is me. She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking, and pulled the heavy door open. He fell, more than walked. Inside, he was covered in mud and blood. His face was a ruin. His left eye was swollen shut, his lips split to the nostril. He clutched his side, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Elias, she screamed, catching him as he stumbled, helping him to the cot. He collapsed onto it, groaning as his ribs protested. He was not shot. He was beaten, viciously. The supplies, she said, her voice frantic. Did you? He shook his head, coughing. Blood flecked his lips. They were waiting, behind the mercantile. 6 of them. He had not even made it to the store. They took the rifle, he whispered, his voice broken. They took my horse. They wanted me to walk back, to think. He reached into his boot, Miraculously, he pulled out a small, heavy box.
I went to Amos's cabin first. Last night. He gave me these. Knew I would need them.
Cartridges. He had the cartridges. Clara wept, tearing strips of linen. She cleaned his face, her hands gentle, her heart a cold, hard knot of rage.
They had a message.
Elias gritted, his eyes shut in pain.
They said,
"This is the last warning. Hand over the woman, or next time, we burn you both out." He grasped her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. He opened his one good eye and looked at her, his gaze burning with a new, terrifying fire.
They said, face worse.
Clara's hands, which had learned to hold a pistol and mend a roof, were now gentle, impossibly gentle, as she cleaned the blood from his face. Elias lay on the cot, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. Every intake of air was a fresh agony. She had seen the ruin of his face, the split lip, the eye swollen shut, the deep purple bruising that was already spreading across his cheekbone and jaw. But it was the stillness of his body that terrified her. He was a man of constant, quiet motion. To see him laid so low, broken and unmoving, was to see a mountain felled. She bathed the cuts with snowmelt and her own linen strips. He gritted his teeth, his one good eye clamped shut, but no sound escaped him. He had walked miles in this condition, carrying the precious box of cartridges, fueled by a will that she could not comprehend. He had done this for her. When she finished cleaning his face, she moved to his torso. He hissed in pain as she, with painstaking care, cut away his blood-soaked shirt. His side was a map of mottled, dark bruising, cracked ribs, at least, perhaps broken. She wrapped his chest tightly, as she had seen him wrap his own arm. He let her, his body rigid with pain, his pride in ashes. When she was done, she sat on the small stool by the fire, her hands stained with his blood. She stared at him, this man who had become her entire world, this stranger who had taken her in, this ghost who had chosen to bleed for her. And she broke. It was not the loud sobbing of her nightmares. It was a silent, racking collapse. Her shoulders shook, and the tears she had held back for months, for years, finally came. Burning hot tracks down her cheeks. He had faced 6 men. He had lost his horse, his rifle. He had been beaten half to death, and they had promised more. They had promised fire. She went to him, kneeling by the cot. He opened his good eye, the gaze clouded with pain and exhaustion.
You have to send me away,
she whispered, her voice choking. She clutched his hand, the one that was not battered.
Elias, please, look at you. They will kill you. They will come here, and they will burn this cabin with you in it. All for me.
She pressed her wet face to his hand.
I am not worth this. I am not worth your life. Let me go. I will walk to them. I will tell them I ran away.
I will do whatever they want. Just let me go. You will die for me. She tried to stand, to run to the door, to end this, to sacrifice herself before he could sacrifice any more. He caught her wrist. His grip, even now, was iron. It was not violent. It was absolute. He held her fast. "And where will you go?" he rasped, his voice a low growl of pain. "To them? To Silas? You think they will just take you back? You think they will let you live, knowing what you know?" "It does not matter if I live," she cried, pulling against his grip. "It matters that you do. You have graves to tend. You have this place. I have nothing. I am nothing. Let me—" "No," he said. The word was final. He used her arm to pull himself up, a strangled groan tearing from his throat. He was sitting, his face request cut off. They fled into the teeth of the storm. The fire was a roaring beast at their backs, a hungry orange glow that painted the falling snow in hues of blood. Elias, his arm around Clara's waist. slumped in the saddle. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through his ribs. Clara rode behind him, her arms locked around his chest, her face pressed against his back. She was the anchor. He was the dead weight. The night was a blur of lashing snow, wind that howled like a mourner, and the agonizing, plodding gait of the single horse. They did not speak. There was no breath to spare. There was only the cold, a living entity that sought to worm its way into their bones, to stop their hearts, to still them forever. By dawn, they were in the high passes, the world a featureless expanse of white. Elias was shivering, a deep, uncontrolled quake that had nothing to do with the cold. The smoke and the shock had settled deep in his lungs. He was feverish, his mind adrift. The horse, a bay mare they had bought with the last of their money, was failing. She was not the mountain-bred gelding Elias had lost in town. She was a farm horse, and this land was killing her. She stumbled, her breath pluming in frosty clouds, her legs coated in ice. She cannot go on. Clara, Elias whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He tried to pull himself from the saddle. Leave me. Take the horse. Go west. Find the law. Be quiet, Clara ordered, her voice sharp with a terror that masqueraded as strength. We are not stopping. But the horse did. She stumbled into a deep drift, her foreleg buckling. She gave a low, exhausted sigh and collapsed onto her side, the snow puffing up around her. She did not try to get up. Her great dark eye rolled back, and a final, shuddering breath left her. They were on foot, in a blizzard, miles from any town, with a wounded man. Elias, Clara said, her voice frantic as she pulled him from the dead animal. Elias, look at me! He sagged against her, his legs unsteady. It is over, he murmured, his one good eye closing. Go, please, live. No, she screamed into the wind. I will not leave you. I am not leaving anyone ever again. She was the one who had been left. She had been discarded, traded, abandoned. Now, she was the one who would not let go. She put her shoulder under his arm, taking his full weight. Walk, she commanded. Walk with me, Elias. He was too weak to fight her. He put one boot in front of the other, his body a leaden weight she dragged through the snow. She refused to let him be left behind. She was no longer the victim. She was a rescuer. She would carry him if she had to, drag him by his collar. But she would not leave him to the cold. They moved for an hour, or perhaps a lifetime. Clara's world shrank to the next step. The snow was up to her thighs, and every movement was a battle. Elias was barely conscious, a dead weight muttering about his wife. Sarah, about a fire long ago. Clara was weeping, the tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. She was going to fail. She had brought this man to this, her secret, her truth. It had cost him his home, and now it would cost him his life. God, she whispered, a word she had not used in years. Please, not this, not him. And then she saw it. Through the swirling white, a shape, darker than the snow. A hovel, an abandoned trapper's cabin, half buried in a drift by the side of a frozen creek. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs, but it was shelter. There, she cried, shaking Elias. Look, we are safe. She dragged him the last 50 yards, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. The door was frozen shut. She used the butt of her pistol to break the ice, shouldered it open, and half fell, half dragged Elias inside. It was a single room, dirt-floored and rank with the smell of old animals and decay, but it was out of the wind. A crude stone fireplace stood in one corner, a pile of forgotten, half-rotted wood beside it. Clara let Elias slide to the floor. He was unconscious, his skin burning to the touch. The fever had taken him. The exertion, the smoke-filled lungs, the deep, ugly gash on his side from the window glass. It had all festered. Clara's panic was a cold, sharp thing. She would not let him die. She worked with a frantic energy. She found the tinderbox in Elias's pack, her frozen fingers fumbling with the flint and steel. She tore bark from the logs, using her knife to shave kindling. A spark caught. She blew on it, her own breath giving it life, until a small, precious flame flickered. She added wood, rotten or not. Smoke filled the cabin, but with it came heat. She took their last blanket and covered Elias. She stripped off his wet coat, his shirt. The wound on his side was ugly, inflamed and seeming with infection. She found the small tin of tallow and pine tar salve, but she knew it was not enough. She melted snow in their small pot, tore the hem from her own dress, and began to clean the wound. He thrashed, crying out. "Sarah!" he yelled, his eyes wide and unseeing. "The barn! Get Samuel, I am coming!"
"It is me, Elias,"
she said, her voice firm, holding him down with her own thin body. "It is Clara. You are safe. The fire is out. You are safe." For 2 days, she did not sleep. She kept the fire roaring. She melted snow, forcing water past his cracked, dry lips. She cleaned the wound. She held him when he shivered, and she cooled his face with wet rags when he burned. He was in the war, giving orders to men long dead. He was at his old cabin, pleading with a wife who was smoke. Clara was alone, fighting a battle for his soul. She was gaunt, her eyes burning in their sockets, but she did not stop. She had been useless her whole life. She would not be useless now. On the 3rd night, the fever broke, but he did not wake. He slipped into a stillness that was more terrifying than the delirium. His breathing was shallow, a faint whisper in the dark cabin. He was pale as the snow outside, his face a mask of old pains. He was letting go. Clara felt a cold dread settle in her heart. She had fought so hard, and she was losing him. She, who had renounced God, who had seen only the cruelty of men, sank to her knees on the dirt floor. She clasped her raw, chapped hands together. She looked at the man who had been given to her like livestock, the man who had turned away when she offered herself, the man who had taught her to shoot, who had shared his grief, who had kissed her with a gentle sorrow, who had walked back from a beating to bring her cartridges.
"Please,"
she whispered to the darkness, the tears rolling down her face. "I do not know who is there. I do not know if you listen, but do not take him. He is all I have. He is the only man who ever saw me. He is the only man who saw me as a person. Please, do not take him. Take me instead. I am used to it. But not him. He is a good man. He kept your book. Please." She stayed there, kneeling, her head resting on the edge of his cot, and finally, exhaustion claimed her. She woke to a touch. A hand, weak but steady, was on her hair. She lifted her head, her heart stopping. Elias was awake. His good eye was open, and it was clear. The fever was gone. He was looking at her. He saw the filth, the exhaustion, the tear tracks. He saw the woman who had dragged him through a blizzard. He tried to speak, his voice a dry croak. "Water," she said, scrambling to get the cup. She lifted his head, helping him drink. He sank back, his gaze never leaving her face. He understood what she had done. He saw the sacrifice in her hollowed-out cheeks. He whispered, his voice rough as stones. "I would not leave you, not for anything." Clara choked on a sob, a sound of profound relief, and laid her head on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. He was alive. They stayed in the cabin for 4 more days. They had no food, save for a small handful of dried jerky in Elias's pack, which she made into a thin broth. They grew weaker, but he grew stronger. The infection had receded. His ribs still ached, but he could move. They talked, their voices low in the small space. They talked of the future, of a place called Oregon, of land that was green. They did not touch. They did not have to. They were bound by something stronger than passion. When he could walk, they left. They had 1 pistol, 10 bullets, and no horse. They walked. They shared the last of the blanket, huddling together for warmth at night. It was a long, brutal journey, but they were together. They reached the town of Bridger's Fork 10 days later. They were not 2 people. They were survivors, shadows of themselves, half-starved and ragged, but walking side by side. Bridger's Fork was a real town, with a main street, a hotel, and a brick-fronted sheriff's office. "We go to the law," Elias said, his voice firm. "No more running." They walked into the office. The man behind the desk was barrel-chested, with a graying mustache and a weary face. A tin star was pinned to his vest. "Sheriff Brody." He looked up from his paperwork, his eyes taking in Clara's torn dress and Elias's battered face. He sighed, expecting another story of drunkenness or domestic trouble. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice flat. "I need to report a crime," Clara said. Elias stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, a silent support. Brody looked at him, then back at her. "Go on." And Clara told her story. She did not weep. She did not hesitate. Her voice was cold, clear, and precise. She spoke of Arthur Vance, of the ledger, of the sabotaged mine. She spoke of being traded to Silas McCabe. She spoke of the night she overheard the murder, of the prospector named Abel Johnson. She spoke of the stolen gold. "Where did this happen?" Brody asked. His interest piqued. "In the valley, outside Garrison." She said, "He is buried on the land the Ute used to call sacred, by Whispering Creek. There are 3 tall pines, standing alone. He is under the middle one, not 5 feet deep. The gold is with him." Brody leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. That is a hell of an accusation. Ma'am, Silas McCabe, Arthur Vance, those are powerful men. Their influence runs all the way to the capital. You are asking me to start a war with Garrison based on your word." His eyes were not unkind, but they were doubtful. He saw a ruined woman, and he saw trouble. "Her word is enough," Elias said, stepping forward. Brody looked at him. "And you are?" Elias Hart. The sheriff's eyes widened. He stood up slowly, leaning over the desk to look at Elias's face, at the scars, at the man. "Captain Hart, Elias Hart, from the war." Elias just nodded. Brody let out a long breath. "My God, I was just a corporal. With the 7th, your unit, you pulled us out of the Fire Creek ambush. We were all dead. You saved us." "You were there?" Elias asked, a flicker of memory in his eyes. "Yes, sir, I was." Brody said the "sir" was unconscious. He owed this man his life. His entire demeanor changed. If Captain Hart says her word is good, then her word is good. He grabbed his hat. "I will get a wagon, and I will take 2 deputies and a tracker. We ride for Garrison today. You 2, get a room at the hotel, get cleaned up, put it on my name." The investigation took a week. Elias and Clara waited. They had a room, a bath, clean clothes bought on credit from the general store. They ate hot food. They slept in a real bed. But they did not touch. They waited. The tension, a 3rd person in the room. On the 8th day, Sheriff Brody returned. His face was grim. "You were right," he said to Clara, who was sitting by the window. "Every word. We found him. Abel Johnson. Just where you said, and the gold. 3 chests of it." The news ripped through Bridger's Fork. It was not just a local crime. It was murder and theft on a massive scale. The town, protective of its own newfound respectability, demanded a hearing. The town hall was packed. It was not a trial, but an inquest. Silas McCabe was there, not in chains, but sitting with 2 lawyers in expensive city suits. Arthur Vance had not come, but his influence was felt. The lawyers were slick. They did not deny the body. They did not deny the gold. They attacked the witness. They attacked Clara. One of them, a man with a smooth, false voice, made her stand. "Is it not true, Miss, well, we do not know what to call you. Is it not true you were the mistress of Mr. Arthur Vance?"
Yes,
Clara said, her hands clenched in her lap. "And is it not true he discarded you for your indiscretions? That he found you to be unstable?"
that is not true,
she said, her voice shaking. "And is it not true," the lawyer continued, his voice rising, "that you were then passed to Mr. McCabe, that you are, in fact, a woman of flexible affections, a harlot, a whore, to be plain?" The room gasped. People whispered. Clara flushed, a deep, painful red. She felt the eyes of every woman in that room on her, judging her, condemning her. "Is it not true," the lawyer pressed, "that this is all a lie, a story you invented with your new protector, Mr. Hart, to extort money from Mr. McCabe, a whore's revenge?"
"No," Clara cried. "It is the truth."
"It is your truth," the lawyer sneered. "The truth of a liar." Before the judge could bang his gavel, Elias stood up. He was clean, shaved, but his face was still a mosaic of fading bruises. He wore his old, worn coat. He looked at no one but the lawyer, and then at Clara. He walked to the front of the room. The whispers stopped. The room went utterly silent, struck by the cold, quiet authority of the man. "You can call her what you like," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor. "You can use your city words. You can try to shame her. You have shamed her. This whole town has—" He turned to the crowd. "You see a fallen woman. You see what you want to see. I see a woman who was handed to me like a piece of meat, bruised and silent. I see a woman who learned to fire a gun when she was shaking so hard she could not stand. I see a woman who pulled me from a burning building. I see a woman who dragged me through a blizzard, who refused to leave me to die, who kept me alive with her own 2 hands when I had given up." He turned back to the lawyers, his gaze so fierce the men took an involuntary step back. "You call her a whore. You call her a liar." He paused, his voice dropping, thick with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him. "I call her the bravest soul I have ever known, and she is speaking the truth, a truth I would die to protect." He went and stood beside Clara's chair. He did not touch her. He just stood there, a shield. The silence that followed was absolute. The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge looked at Elias, at the unyielding truth in his eyes, and then at the pale and shaking woman beside him. And for the first time, the judge saw her not as a harlot, but as a person. Elias Hart's words fell into the packed town unlawful, and the silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any gavel. The smooth-talking lawyer from the city, for the first time in his career, had no reply. His case, built on shame and insinuation, had been dismantled by plain, brutal truth. He had tried to paint Clara as a whore, and Elias, with his bruised face and unwavering voice, had painted her as a hero. Sheriff Brody, who had been standing at the back of the room, began to move. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, his hand not on his pistol, but on the set of iron handcuffs at his belt. He walked past the lawyers, past the judge's bench, and stopped directly in front of Silas McCabe. Silas, who had been watching the proceedings with a smug, confident air, finally felt the shift. His face, normally florid and self-satisfied, paled to a sickly gray. He looked at the sheriff, then at his lawyers, as if expecting them to stop this. "Silas McCabe," Sheriff Brody said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "In light of the testimony of Miss Clara, the testimony of Captain Hart, and the physical evidence, namely the body of Abel Johnson and 3 chests of gold recovered from your family's land. I am arresting you for murder, theft, and conspiracy to silence a witness." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was a sharp, metallic click that echoed like a gunshot. The town did not cheer. It erupted. A woman in the back screamed. Men began shouting, some in outrage at Silas, others in outrage for him, the McCabe clan and their allies. Men who owed their jobs and land to Silas surged to their feet, but Sheriff Brody's deputies were ready. They moved to block the aisle, their hands on their holsters. Elias, in a single, fluid motion, stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body as the crowd pressed in. The moral rot of Garrison, held just beneath the surface, was now exposed and festering in the open air. The town was shaken, cleaved in two. There were those who saw Clara as a truth-teller, a victim who had finally found her voice. They looked at her with a new, hesitant respect, their gazes full of apology for their own silence. But there were others, the wives of the men who did business with Silas, the merchants who profited from the McCabe family's control. They stared at Clara with a venom that was colder than the winter. She was not a hero. She was a homewrecker, a troublemaker, a whore who had brought ruin to their quiet, corrupt peace. As the deputies dragged a protesting, sputtering Silas McCabe from the hall, the judge banged his gavel, calling for order. He looked at Elias and Clara, his expression a mixture of gratitude and deep unease. "Miss Clara," the judge said, his voice strained, "what you have done, it is a great service to this territory, but you have made powerful enemies. Arthur Vance is still at large. The McCabe family will not let this rest, this town." He motioned to the angry, divided crowd. "It is not safe for you. The town council offers you protection, a room at the hotel, with a guard, until this is settled." Clara looked at the faces staring at her, the hatred, the pity, the fear. She felt the warmth of Elias's back against her shoulder. She had been protected by men like these before. She had been kept in rooms, guarded, and called property. She would not be a prisoner again, not even for her own safety. She stepped out from behind Elias. She was still pale, still thin, but she stood tall. Her voice, though quiet, was clear and steady. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "But I already have that." She turned and put her hand on Elias's arm, the one that was not wrapped in bandages. "His name is Elias." She looked at Elias, and in that look, a decision was made. They did not belong here. They did not belong in the world of laws and lawyers, of whispers and shaming. Their life was on the mountain. Elias nodded. A small, fierce movement of his bruised face. He looked at Sheriff Brody. "We will need our things, and a new horse, and supplies." "Anything," Brody said, his voice thick with respect. "You will have it." 2 days later, they rode out of Bridger's Fork. They had a new horse, a sturdy sorrel mare, and a mule loaded with tools and provisions, an axe, a saw, sacks of flour and salt, seed grain, and new blankets. Sheriff Brody and half the town had seen them to the edge, a strange procession of well-wishers and silent, angry watchers. The journey back was not a flight. It was a claiming. They were not fugitives. They were free souls, seeking a peace they would have to build with their own hands. The air was warmer, and the snows were in full retreat, revealing the green, raw earth of spring. They rode in a comfortable silence, the plod of the horses a quiet rhythm. They were leaving the world of men behind, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt truly safe. When they reached the clearing, the silence was different. It was not the peace of their old solitude. It was the dead, hollow silence of destruction. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a black, rectangular scar on the earth. The stone chimney stood alone, a dark monolith against the sky, a tombstone for the life they had briefly known. The smell of soot and wet ash hung heavy in the air. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking into the blackened mud. He walked to the center of the scar, his face a mask. This was his home, his sanctuary, the last piece of his old life and the first piece of his new one. And it was gone. He had lost this too. He knelt, picking up a twisted piece of melted metal, the hinge from the door. Clara came and stood beside him. She did not speak. She did not offer comfort. She simply stood in the ashes with him, a silent partner to his grief. He had lost his wife and child here. Now he had lost the shelter he had built to contain that loss. He let the metal fall from his hand. He looked defeated, the last of his strength finally gone. Clara touched his shoulder.
Elias,
she said softly. He looked up at her, his one good eye bleak.
They did not burn the trees,
she said, nodding toward the forest.
And they did not burn the stones of the fireplace. And we, she put her hand on his, we are still here, so we build it again.
He stared at her, at the strength in her face, the resolve in her eyes. She was not the broken thing he had rescued. She was the woman who was rescuing him. A slow spark returned to his gaze. He nodded. Once. He stood up, wiping the soot from his hands onto his trousers. Aye, he said, his voice rough. We build it again. They began that day. They did not clear the scar. They chose a new spot, 10 yards higher, with a better view of the valley, anchored by 2 towering pines. They would build it stronger. They would build it together. The work was brutal, but it was a joyful, healing labor. Elias, his ribs still mending, could not do the heavy lifting he was used to. He had to rely on Clara. He taught her to wield the axe, not for kindling, but for felling. He showed her how to read the lean of a tree, how to cut the wedge. They worked the 2-man saw, pulling it back and forth, their movements finding a rhythm, their breathing matched. The rasp of the saw and the clean scent of pine resin filled the air. Elias was the architect, the mind. Clara was his hands, his strength, his unflagging will. When he faltered, his side aching, she would take the adze and square the logs herself, her small frame wielding the tool with a focused, determined grace. He would watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his battered face. They worked from sunrise to sunset. They slept under the stars by a campfire, their bodies aching, but their minds at peace. They ate simple meals of bread and beans. And they talked. They spoke of the trees, of the angle of the roof. They did not speak of the fire, or the hearing, or the men who haunted them. They spoke only of the building. They raised the walls, log by log. It was a slow, agonizing process. They built a lever system to hoist the heavy timbers, the day they finally set the main ridgepole. They stood back, covered in sweat and dirt, and looked at their creation. It was a house, a real house. Clara turned to Elias, a wide, true smile splitting her face, a smile of pure, exhausted pride. He smiled back. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, a gesture that lit his scarred face and reached his eyes. As the cabin took shape, so did their life. While Elias carved new furniture, a table, 2 strong chairs, a bed frame built into the wall, Clara took the seeds they had bought and cleared a patch of land. She broke the rocky soil, her hands bleeding, and planted a garden, corn, beans, squash. She was putting down roots, literally, in the land that had claimed so much. One clear afternoon in the late spring, the snow was finally gone from all but the highest peaks. The ground was soft, and new wildflowers were pushing up through the duff. Elias had been quiet all morning. He picked up a shovel and walked toward the edge of the clearing, to the 2 weathered crosses. Clara watched him go. She left her garden and followed, her heart aching for him. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. The crosses were leaning, the wood rotting after so many winters. He looked at the resting place of his wife and son, the grief still a palpable thing around him. Clara came and knelt beside the small grave. Samuel's.
She gently, with her bare hands, began to pull the new weeds that had sprung up, clearing the earth. She found a flat, smooth river stone and took the knife from her belt. Elias watched, his throat tight, as she sat and began to patiently scratch into the stone. She was not a carver, but she was determined. She spent an hour, her tongue sticking out in concentration, cutting the letters deep. When she was done, she held it up. Samuel Hart, beloved son. She did the same for the larger grave. Sarah Hart, beloved wife. She set the stones at the base of the crosses. It was permanent. It was real. She had not tried to replace his family. She had honored them. Elias knelt beside her. He did not speak. He reached out and touched the rough letters of his wife's name. Then he looked at Clara. He took her hand, the one that was calloused and stained with dirt, and he kissed her raw knuckles. That night, they finished the roof. The cabin was done. It was larger than the old one. Elias had built a small, separate room, a second room, with its own window. They sat by their new hearth, the first fire crackling, casting warm shadows on the fresh-cut wood. The cabin smelled of pine and possibility. Clara had been quiet, working on something in her lap. She had found it in the ashes of the old barn, a single, rusted horseshoe nail. For weeks, she had worked on it, heating it in the fire, hammering it on a flat stone, filing it with a small rasp, polishing it with sand. She held it out to him. It was a ring. It was not silver or gold. It was dark, forged iron, polished to a dull, smooth shine. It was a circle of strength made from fire and ruin. "It is for you," she said, her voice hesitant. "For your hand, to remember that we build." Elias took it. He looked at the simple, powerful object. He saw the hours of work in it, the love. He saw the nail, a thing meant to hold, and the ring, a thing meant to bind. He, the man of silence, the man of war, felt a blush climb his neck. It was the preacher's son, the farmer, the man who had dreamed of a partner. He looked at her, this woman who had fought for him, this woman who had rebuilt his life from the ashes. He did not put the ring on. He held it in his palm. "Clara," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion that terrified and thrilled him. I have nothing. This land, this cabin, my hands, that is all." "It is all I want," she whispered. He slid from his chair and knelt, awkwardly, on the hearth. He took her left hand, the one with the scars from the kindling. He looked up at her, his dark eyes vulnerable. "Clara," he stammered, the blush deepening. Will you have me? Will you be my wife?" Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She had expected him to accept her gift. She had not expected this, not this, from him. Tears, not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful, welled in her eyes. "Yes," she cried, a broken, laughing sob. "Yes, Elias, yes." He slid the iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood and pulled her to her feet and kissed her. It was not the kiss of grief they had shared before. It was a kiss of promise, deep and sure, a kiss of homecoming. Time passed. The summer was kind. Their garden grew. The cabin was a home. The fall came, and with it, the first storms of the high country. One night, a fierce wind howled outside, rattling the new, sturdy door. But inside, the fire was warm and bright. The new room, their room, was quiet and safe. Clara was curled in Elias's arms, lying on a thick bearskin rug before the fire. She was no longer gaunt. Her hair was clean and long, and her face, though still scarred, was full of peace. He held her, his arms strong around her, his head resting on hers. The storm outside was a distant, fading echo. They were safe. She tilted her head, looking into the flames. "You were never meant to return me,"
she whispered, her voice full of a quiet wonder. Silas, Arthur, they did not give me to you to be a gift. They gave me to you to be lost. Elias tightened his hold, kissing her hair. She turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. But you were never meant to return me. You were meant to love me. He looked at her, this woman who was his wife, his partner, his strength. He saw his whole life in her eyes. And I will never let you go. He replied, Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West. We would love to hear your thoughts and where you are listening from in the comments so you can connect with other listeners. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel.